What was the significance of Frederic Bastiat's concept of what is seen and unseen? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy, including a little bit of economic history. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I trust you had a nice Thanksgiving there in Charleston. You don't actually live in Charleston, but
right east of Charleston, Mount Pleasant.
Yeah, I trust you had a good Thanksgiving.
Absolutely. We had a nice turkey dinner. We had some guests over, most enjoyable time. And I, of course, recited the Thanksgiving story that it's all the story of how the Pilgrim Fathers discovered the errors of communism and introduced free enterprise into America.
Okay, let's take up where we left off a couple of weeks ago before the holiday break. We're dealing with the classical economists, giving a little bit of a history lesson here in the history of economic thought. And of course, you're carrying the ball on this, given your economics profession and your long experience with the history of economic thought. But we left off with Frederic Bastiat, and so I thought we'd continue with him, especially his concept of what is seen and not seen, which has turned out to be one of the most important economic insights in the field of economics, Richard. So why don't you take it away and tell us what Bastiat taught us about what is seen and unseen?
Well, just a reminder, Frederic Bastiat was this very well-known French economist in the first half of the 19th century, best known for his little essay, The Law, which explains the notion of individual rights and private property and how government can abuse these things. But he's probably as well known for this piece that we wanted to spend a little time on today, called What is Seen and What is Not Seen. He sets this story up with the following little story. Imagine that there's a bakery and some young man comes by the front of the bakery and picks up a rock or a brick and throws it through the window. And the baker comes out shaking his fist, the youth of today, no respect. And a crowd soon forms. And, oh, how terrible, no discipline, no respect for private property. But then someone decides to be sort of philosophic and says, well, yes, it's a tragedy that the baker's window has been broken. But just think of it. It's going to create work, jobs for others. Does not the glazier have to be hired to replace the window pane in front of the bakery store? Will he not hire some helper to make the glaze and to install it? And therefore, the baker's misfortune is the gain for the glazier and those he might employ. And Bastiat says that's what is seen. That's clear what is seen. Yes, the baker will have to replace the broken window pane. He will have to expend income and resources on hiring the glazier to make it and install it. And the glazier may have to hire the assistance of a helper to do the production and the installation. But Bastiat then asks, but what is not seen? What is not seen? And what is not seen is that, let us suppose the young street urchin had not thrown the brick through the window. What would the baker have done with the money instead that he will have to incur as an expense to replace the window pane? He might very well have invested in a second oven that would enable him to increase his production of bread each day and therefore improve the standard of living of his customers. Or he might have bought his wife a new coat or a new pair of shoes for his children. And in this case, the society would have been wealthier. Why would it have been wealthier? Because it would have had the window pane unbroken, plus whatever it is the baker would have, out of his savings, been able to purchase instead. A second oven, which would have increased the production and the standard of living all in the society, an improvement in his own family through a new coat or pair of shoes for members of his family. In this case, when the window pane is broken, we're poorer. We no longer have the window pane. Scarce resources have to be utilized to reproduce it. people's labor has to be redirected to replace that which we had. And we have to either forego or may never be able to have the things that we could have had instead if the window pane had not been broken. And that's what is unseen. Now, if this sounds like, well, yeah, I understand that story, people can't really believe that. Well, when 9/11 occurred on September 11th, 2001, when 9/11 occurred, the trade towers were destroyed. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. There was a lot of collateral destruction in the neighborhood and the buildings surrounding the New York trade towers. What a tragedy, how disastrous, how monstrous of these terrorists to do this, the destruction, the wanton disregard for human life. But then Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner, columnist for the New York Times, decides to wax eloquent in one of his Times columns. Yes, it's a tragedy, it's an abomination, a terrorist attack on the American homeland, the destruction, the loss of life. But there's a silver lining. Think of the jobs and the work it's going to create to have to rebuild the trade towers, to reconstruct all of the destroyed properties around there. Yes, the misfortune and the tragedy and the loss of life, however, still has a degree of a positive side effect. So we have a Nobel Prize winner in economics repeating 150 years after Frederic Bastiat's death in 1850, the same fallacy that he was underlying and pointing out the errors of in this famous essay. Now Bastiat was making the case that this is seen every place. You know, the idea that well, you know, when government spends money, it stimulates the economy. It creates jobs, it creates business opportunities, but it doesn't. If the government uses tax money, anything that it does that is seen, the new road that it constructs and the construction company hired to build it, the public school roof that is retarred and the people hired to do the tarring, the additional post office built in podunk nowhere. The fact is that what is unseen is that if the government has taxed the money for these purposes, what is not seen is all the other things that private individuals would have utilized their own money for if it had not been taxed away for these visible government activities. What about the individual who would have used that tax money as additional savings to prepare for his own retirement, or the money to pay for his child's college education, or to invest in an enterprise, or indirectly invest by making it available for a private investor to borrow in a financial institution and increase the capital and the employment opportunities in other directions that would have increased the standards of living and the material well-being of the society as a whole through investment if it had not been taxed away for these visible government activities. We can see that constantly in various walks of life. What if the government doesn't tax, but it borrows? Well, here it seems to be free. Taxpayers have not been taxed, and the government has been spending money on all these things. But again, Jacob, what is not seen? Where does the borrowed money come from? It must come from people in the financial markets who had decided to save a portion of their previous earned income. But rather than being borrowed by private sector individuals who would have been guided by the profit motive and asking, what is it that consumers want? What would they have been willing to pay for some product that I could make based upon a successful investment project? And how would it improve people's lives, out of which I would have made a profit and been able to pay back that which I had borrowed, versus the government project that may or may not be profitable by some standard because it is not tested by the profit and loss of the marketplace, but a decision by those in political power decide to siphon off people's wealth either by taxing or borrowing and directing it into ways of which we have no knowledge of whether it is useful in any way to those people who would or have been willing to buy it, maybe if they had been left alone to have that money in their own pocket. As a result, we can go through all of these things. Bastiat also talked about the example, you know, at the end of the Cold War, people talked about a peace dividend. Oh, we don't have to spend as much on national defense. The Cold War has been won. The Soviet Union is gone. The soldiers can be brought home who are manning the fortresses of freedom around the world. But it soon was said, well, there's benefits of this military spending. But what if the private sector doesn't pick up the slack? The same argument that was made after the Second World War. But what was unseen is that if the taxes are lowered, if money is left in people's pockets, people will then spend their incomes based on lower taxes that previously had gone for defense purposes on private sector goods and services, investment opportunities in projects, employment chances that otherwise wouldn't have been there, that would represent what consumers wanted, and investment opportunities that would be based upon the profit judgments would increase the standard of living as a population as a whole. These distinctions must not be forgotten. And I'll just use one more example. A program that has been around for a century now are farm price supports. This is a program in which the government sets a minimum price for certain products, such as dairy products, milk and butter, and says they will guarantee to pay that price for any amount that the farmers grow, which the consumers don't buy at that guaranteed minimum price. Well, where does the money come from to pay that? Well, first, by jacking up the price to a minimum sale price, consumers pay more for it. That's a cost to consumers. And they tend to buy less of it the higher the price is. And the rest of the money for the surplus created then has to be borne by the taxpayers, because the government has to collect the tax money to then pay the farmers for the outputs that nobody wants to buy at the guaranteed prices. But it goes beyond there in terms of the unseen. If the higher guaranteed support price induces dairy farmers to want to have larger dairy herds, Jacob, don't they need larger grazing lands? Of course, for larger dairy herds. But where is the extra grazing land going to come from? Well, resources are scarce. If some land is going to be now used to expand grazing areas, then it's going to have to come from some other use. Let's imagine that, therefore, to have larger grazing areas, we have to take some land out of wheat farming. Well, that means the wheat crops will be fewer. And with lower wheat crops, then a major ingredient for the making of bread will be more costly and less available. So bread prices will now rise. And that is another unseen result of this. But in all of this, what will the public often be misinformed about? Oh, the farmers now have a decent price, even though they've borne it by paying a higher price and being taxed to pay for the surplus. And when they complain, look at bread prices rising, those greedy businessmen in the bakery industry. No, the bread prices have risen because since you've had the farm price support and you've had induced larger dairy herds, there's been less wheat growing, and that has resulted in higher prices for more scarce bread. All of these unseen chains of connection are what results from these government interventions. The difficulty is precisely because they're links in a chain of causation several steps down the road. They're not immediately seen, and their effects are diffused, whereas what the government does is right before our eyes. Oh, the dairy farmer has a larger income. Oh, the road has been built, or the tarring of the school roof has been done. And as a consequence of this, it looks like the government is this miracle worker of jobs and wealth creation and job generation, when in fact the society is misdirected and wasteful and poorer at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a great summation of Bastiat's point. And, you're absolutely right. I mean, this point, what is seen and unseen, is still so applicable today. In fact, I think that if every American would read Bastiat's essay on the broken window fallacy, or what is seen and unseen, I think would go a long way to restoring economic liberty in America. Let me give you an extreme example. Let's assume that the American people are free to keep 100% of their earnings. There's no income tax at all. And that's not so unusual. That's not pie in the sky and so forth. That was the American way of life for more than 100 years. There was no federal income tax for more than 100 years. People were free to keep everything they earned. So let's assume that that's the system under which we've all been born and raised. Let's assume that nothing ever changed, no federal income tax, everybody keeps 100%. And then one day the federal government says, we have decided to change the system. And we're now going to tax 90% of your income. And you're going to keep 10%. We're going to let you keep 10%. So that means that somebody that was earning, let's say, $60,000 is now earning $6,000. Well, obviously that has significantly reduced that person's standard of living. But the government says, look what we have done with all your money. We built an interstate highway program. We have a massive military establishment where we've been able to produce tanks and airplanes. Look at all these wonderful things. Well, the people at that point would be, I think, easily able to recognize what is unseen here, that they've had a significant and extreme diminution in their standard of living because they've seen it happen. The problem, Richard, as I see it, is that we've all been born and raised under this kind of system, which is not so extreme as to take 90% of people's income, but let's say it takes 20 or 25% of income. In that case, it's very difficult for people to conceive of what is unseen because they've never seen it. They haven't seen what they were free to do with their money because they never were free to keep that 20 or 25%. And that's the big obstacle we face. The government can say, look at the interstate highway system. Look how wonderful it is. But what is unseen is all the income that was seized from people that they didn't get to use for their vacations, for their college education, as you pointed out, their children's college education, their house payments, recreational things, clothing, or a new car. They don't think in those kind of terms because they never were able to keep that amount of money. Another aspect of this is the deleterious aspects of these socialist programs, like the interstate highway system. It's easy to point to look how easy it has made for us to cross the country. But think about all the businesses that were put out of business because of the interstate highway system. I mean, they unleashed tremendous economic suffering. All of the motels and the restaurants that were along the state highway system before the interstate highway system, people who depended on this revenue, they were put out of business, most of them overnight, because the interstate highway system now circumvented the little towns in which these restaurants and motels and other things, tourist attractions, were located. Those people were sent into bankruptcy. There's also the neighborhoods that they destroyed with this grandiose socialist project. I mean, long established neighborhoods, especially of the poor. You know, the wealthy had enough influence where they could get the highways diverted to other parts of town, to the poorer parts of towns. But the poor people didn't have that political influence, and so they destroyed entire neighborhoods. Now, they gave them eminent domain money, but I mean, how valuable was that? It's very difficult to go out and buy a substitute house with the money that they give you under comparable values and so forth. So there's another unseen consequence of these government programs. And then let me wrap this up by saying that, you know, we're often told that if we dismantle, say, the entire national security state and restored a limited government republic, that this would produce economic catastrophe. Because think of all the soldiers that would be discharged in the private sector. They'd no longer be a gigantic military establishment, no more CIA agents. Think of those people being laid off from their jobs, the NSA surveillance people being laid off, all the bars and restaurants that are surrounding military bases, they'd go out of business. And so, again, that's an example of what is seen. What is unseen is that everybody would now have all that money in their pockets in the private sector, doing what they wanted to do with their own money. And that would produce the jobs and the opportunities for all the people that were being laid off from the giant military industrial complex dismantling. So what we're really talking about is a system where people are free to decide for themselves what to do with their money, Richard. It's their money. And lost in all this, it's not the government's money. It's not society's money. It's people's own money that they have produced, and they should be free to do what they want with it. And that's the unseen consequence of here, is that people have been deprived of the right to do what they want with what belongs to them.
No, you mentioned, the highway system and people whose properties and businesses were lost along the way. I think the movie is called Raintree County, starring Montgomery Clift. It was made in the 1950s. And it's all about Montgomery Clift playing this government agent who's come to this area of the Tennessee Valley to inform these people that they're going to have to evacuate, give up, be evicted from their home for the building of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the dams. It's going to be flooded. And these people don't want to give up their home and their property. And they're compelled and forced to do this. I don't know what that was in the mind of the writers and the producers and the directors who made this movie, but an underlining theme of this is that government is basically displacing human beings from the place where they live, where they were born, where they work, which they view as their home, all because the government has decided we have to flood your areas to make reservoirs to have the Tennessee Electrical Valley Authority. No choice. Yeah, eminent domain, what the government views as fair value, but whether you want to take that fair value or not, you're out. And that epitomizes what these government programs end up doing. And once those people are gone and being displaced, they're never seen again. But what is lost and what is unseen is all the lives that have been uprooted, the choices and the actions and activities and investments and enjoyments of life they would have had if they would have been just left alone without the government doing this by force.
Yeah, another example is right here in Virginia. I mean, I'm sure you could find examples of this all across the country, but right here in Virginia, where they made the Blue Ridge Parkway and the Shenandoah National Park, there are horror stories of people that they just threw off their lands. And Bart Frazier, FFS vice president, many years ago, wrote a fantastic article on the experiences some of these people had. And since then, I know there's been a great book, or maybe even before then, on the horror stories arising out of this eminent domain taking, and people resisted it. They'd owned these properties there in the western part of Virginia for generations. And suddenly the government comes in and says, oh, we're going to build this little nice sliver of highway through this mountain range, or we're going to have a national park here. And they just physically threw these people off their land. I mean, it's just an absolute horror story. And like I say, there's a great book that documents this. And it's just the tip of the iceberg, Richard. And again, that's what is unseen in all this.
Part of the unseen of this is that when government builds these highway networks, zones that, this is how cities and communities will be laid out. This will be residential housing. This will be commercial shopping. This will be in industry and manufacturing, for entertainment, etc. What is unseen is how the land and the directions of how people would want to develop it would have evolved spontaneously in these unintended ways, that is, non-centrally planned ways, if they were just left alone. So we are left with these legacies of urban and highway central planning, which hides the reality of what would have developed in the way people would have found it useful. Where do they want roads, given where they want to live, where they want to work, rather than the government laying out a highway system and then in conjunction with that laying out urban planning and residential and land planning patterns that may fit the aesthetic views of the planners, but have no relationship to how people themselves would have wanted to use that land, or settle, or to work, or to live, or to shop, or go for entertainment. And therefore the spontaneous evolution of the institutions and the infrastructure of the society, if the government had not superimposed this plan structure on them. And all you see is the plan structure. Oh, how nice the road system. Oh, how neatly laid out the city by plan. But what has been co-opted are all the individual plans and the associative, collaborative, voluntary plans of all the real human beings that would have emerged and taken form and shape and configuration if the government had just never intervened and superimposed their plan on the society to begin with.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that there are also seen consequences in addition to the unseen consequences. For example, look what they did with the interstate highway system. They totally altered the balance within transportation in America. I mean, what happened to the train industry? It's put out of business because the interstate highway system was effectively a free subsidy to the automobile industry. If it hadn't been for that, the automobile industry would have been responsible for building the roads, buying the land up. There would have been probably a lot less vehicles on the roads, because it's more difficult to voluntarily buy property for roads than it is to just go in there and condemn them through government action. So the probability is we would have had a much more balanced transportation system, including passenger train travel. And also, Richard, there's the same consequences of government regulations. One of the big crises that so many cities in America have is homelessness. But they don't want to acknowledge that the root cause of the homelessness problem is their zoning regulations. This is one of the seen consequences, but a seen consequence that they just do not want to acknowledge. And when you go and you tell them, look, if you want to get rid of your homeless problem, get rid of your zoning. Oh man, they go up in arms with that. Oh no, we couldn't do that. We have to have central planning with respect to how people use their property. Well, okay, well then acknowledge that you and your central planning socialist system is the root cause of the homelessness problem. They can't bring themselves to do that.
Well, that's all part of the wider psychological element that people want the benefits of these government programs, but they refuse to acknowledge or understand or want to bear the costs, either hidden or visible, like you're pointing out. They somehow want this aesthetic beauty, but none of the spillover effects that result in it. Less housing for both rich, medium, and poor, less availability of housing, more people finding it difficult to find any type of roof over their head, and many therefore ending up homeless, not because they're drug addicts or bums, but just the difficulty of, given what the market circumstances are, laden with regulations and taxes, to get a job and earn an income, what they can then afford, living on the street or living in their car.
Okay, well, on that note, we're about out of time, but why don't you give us a little bit of coming attractions here? Are we almost finished with the classical economists?
We're almost finished, but there is one member of a person influenced by the classical school that we would be remiss not to spend some time to discuss, and that is Karl Marx. He adopted the classical labor theory of value. He believed that there were these conflicts between the classes in society, and the classical economists did talk about classes in ways that made it conceptually easy for Marx to reach his own conclusions and create his own system about. So I think what we need to spend a little bit of time on, certainly next time, is who Karl Marx was, what the gist of his ideas were, why perhaps we can understand why they had the influence they've had, and what are their fundamental and inescapable weaknesses, contradictions, and errors.
All right, well, you mentioned the concept of value, which we really haven't discussed, but which is a central element of the classical economists' thinking. And that goes all the way back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the labor theory of value, the cost of production theory of value, the subjective theory of value. So do you want to discuss that first as a prelude to Marx, or do you want to discuss it in the context of Marx? It will be part of it. Okay, that sounds great. Well, then we'll start with Karl Marx in the next segment. And Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. I want to thank you all for tuning in. I should mention that we've sent out our end-of-year fundraising letters to y'all. I'll talk a little bit more about it in the future episodes here, but I hope you'll give that your careful consideration to run our foundation and to have these kind of programs. We need your support. You funded us for some 34 years, and for that, I am very honored and I'm very grateful, and I hope that we can count on your support for the coming year. So, Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.